Welcome back to Gloved Up Garage. I wish I could say that this was my new project. This belongs to a friend of mine. This is an '04 Mercury Marauder, one of the more rare colors that you see. This is dark Torador red, and this one's gonna need some love. So life has happened for this gentleman, and this car has sat for 2 or 3 years. Luckily, he had a very good California car cover over top of it to protect the paint, but it's still dirty. We're gonna wash it up. We got a lot to do to this one. With it sitting for so long, we need to go through the fluids, we need to go through the brakes, we need to replace the tires, and there's a couple of little odds and ends that we're gonna work on. Anytime you got an older car like this one that sits for any kind of time where it's not driven, things are gonna go wrong. The cool thing about this car, this is not just a red Marauder. This thing is, it's got a little bit of work done to it. So we'll get this hood open. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Yeah, this has a supercharger on it from an '03 or an '04 Cobra. And the supercharger, the inlet, and the elbow have all been polished up. Of course, they're aluminum housings. Someone went through and cleaned them all up, polished them, and it looks amazing. The cam covers have also been powder coated in black. These would have been natural, like aluminum finish. They wouldn't have been cleaned off. And then he had some custom coil covers that we put on here too. We got a catch can over here to capture the oil that is somewhat vaporized by this engine, and it goes into this catch can, keeps it from getting sucked back up into the intake, making a mess of the supercharger, and possibly detonating because of the oil mixed in. So when you do the Eaton swap on a Marauder, it's kind of a bolt on, but there are some things that you have to do to this car to relocate some items. You're using the supercharger setup off of an '03 and '04 Cobra, and that is the lower intake, the blower plate. There's actually a heat exchanger, like a radiator, sits underneath the supercharger. Got the supercharger, the elbow, the inlet. Of course, you could replace this with a cold air tube, what they call the zip tube. You got your mass air meter and your air filter. Now, with this setup coming over here and feeding from the passenger side of the vehicle, where the battery normally sits is right here. You're going to move the battery over to the driver's side. There's a couple little brackets and things that you need to make to move this battery tray over. The fuse box gets rotated from kind of left to right to front to rear. That gives you enough room to fit everything in here. This reservoir over here, that's actually for that intercooler heat exchanger. And then inside of the grill area, this is actually a second radiator, which is for the heat exchanger, or what they would call the heat exchanger. Basically what happens, hot air goes through this, it hits the radiator underneath the supercharger, it gets cooled off because of the cool water running through the supercharger. That heat is exchanged out here to this radiator. Wind blows through it while you're moving, or just air moving from the fan, cools that water back off, sends it back up through the hoses and into the heat exchanger underneath the supercharger. One of the other things you have to do to make this supercharger setup work on a Marauder is you have to provide some brackets for the belt drive of the supercharger. It's driven off of the lower crank pulley, and these brackets are made out of billet aluminum. This is the belt tensioner for the supercharger. And then there's another bracket right here. It's kind of a U shape, and that is to flip the alternator around. And some people will say, well, maybe the alternator won't work going the wrong direction. It absolutely works. It will spin in either direction and make electricity. So with those brackets, moving the wiring around, that's pretty much a majority of the stuff that you have to do to make it work on this car. Anytime you have a car that sits for a long time, you may even notice it after a car sits for a week or so, and if you get a decent amount of rain, the brake rotors will start to rust up. Well, this car was no exception. It had a couple of years of rust built up on the rotors. And to me, it looks like the rotors might be a little on the thin side, but we'll actually measure them out, see if we can get them turned, clean these wheels up. These tires are gonna go away. You can see down here at the bottom, we got some dry rot showing on the tires, on the sidewalls. So even though there's plenty of tread left on them, they're just not gonna be any good, and we'll need to get those replaced. We're gonna go with stock size in the front and possibly stock in the rear. something I haven't really addressed yet. The owner did some research and he said that Nitto doesn't make this size anymore. And this size is definitely larger than what's normally in the rear of the Marauder. If I remember right, my car has two 45, 55 18s in the back. And looks like this is a 265 50 18. So we'll have to do some more research, see if we can find these tires anywhere. I completely believe the owner that they are not available anymore. So we might have to go with that stock size in the rear just to get this thing back on the road. He can address maybe widening the wheels at some point in the future and then going with like a 295 or a 305 tire. We know the vehicle is going to need tires. It's going to need some attention paid to the brakes and the fluid. The paint is really not as bad as I had expected it to be. The cover he had on this vehicle is a high dollar California cover. I know it's supposed to be wind and water resistant, and it did one heck of a job of keeping this car protected. Our weather in Kentucky is a mess. It's all over the place. In the wintertime, it can get down into negative temps. In the summertime, it can get up to 100 degrees with 100% humidity. We get a lot of debris, a lot of pollution and stuff like that in the Louisville area because it's a valley. It gets a lot of dust and a lot of things that can really ruin the paint job of a car. And in the case of this, it looks like it's a lot of just dust, a lot of maybe some pollen and some other stuff that have just collected on the surface. And for the grand scheme of things, it's really not that bad. You know, a lot of detailers may look at this and say, oh, it's horrible, it needs to be buffed, but it's really not bad. For the amount of time this thing sat, and with a cover on it, the owner of this vehicle is not upset about it. I'm definitely not upset. We'll get this thing cleaned up pretty good. I think a majority of this will come off with just a regular soap and suds bucket wash. I'll be very careful when I do this just to keep any of this debris from getting rubbed into the paint. But this thing is going to sparkle and shine with a good buff, a good wax, and some ceramic coating. So I'm going to talk the owner into getting this thing into a detail shop and letting them have their way with it, because these red Marauders, when they're cleaned up, they just sparkle. I mean, this dark Torador red paint is one of those ones from Ford that just looks amazing when it's clean. So I fully expect this paint to come back and to look absolutely beautiful like this car once did. And that's my goal, is to help this guy out, get the spark of this car back into his life. You may not know, but the interior of the Marauder had two options as far as color goes. The standard option was charcoal, and then this is what they call the light flint. So it's a light flint gray. You got light flint front and rear seats, and then the upper panels of the interior and the headliner were also light flint. So it's quite a bit lighter than the charcoal gray that my interior is. The charcoal, you know, obviously is a much darker color. It's very similar to the gray that's on the door panels and the console. So it's kind of an unusual color combo. And then this car also has the optional sunroof on it. And with the 300B cars, which is the ordering code that they had for the Marauders, 300B cars came with the heated seats. They came with traction control. That's the pedal adjustment switch, and then you got traction control there. And then 300B also did not include a clock in the middle of the dash. They actually integrated it into the stereo. That is a majority of what's different about the interior of this being an 04 versus my 03. And with that, he has also added some gauges in the pillar here. We've got a boost gauge, we've got an air-fuel ratio, and we got a fuel pressure gauge. So it's really good to keep an eye on, especially when you're driving something like this. It's got a supercharger. This is an OBD2 setup. It will pull timing and do the things it needs to do, but sometimes it's nice to just be able to keep an eye on the gauge to tell you what's going on. With any project that I'm taking on that I know I've got a lot of things I need to do, I always make a list. You might have seen that in some of my other videos, but this is not going to be any different. So I've got everything that I need to do lined out on this piece of plastic with a Sharpie. I can cross them off as I get them done. With that long list of items and systems that we need to address, this is not something I'm going to be able to knock out in just 1 or 2 videos. This is definitely going to be a multi-part series, as we go through each one of these systems and address everything and repair things, we'll have content to put out there to show you guys the process of putting a car back on the road, just like I did with mine. In this case, it's a little cooler because it's supercharged, it's got less miles, and it's a rare color. My plan is to work on this as much as I possibly can in my off time. I want to keep this a very positive experience for the owner of this vehicle. So please give us all the positivity in the comments. Give us some likes. If you like what you see here and you want to watch the restoration, quote unquote, of this vehicle, then hit that subscribe button and watch as we put this car back into tip-top shape and get it on the road. Everybody, thanks for watching. Stay gloved up.